Are you fascinated by the strange and mysterious in our world? Do you find yourself drawn to odd and unusual events or peculiar historical moments that aren't talked about in the history books?
Do you feel as though you have a connection to forces or specters unseen, or that you're not entirely alone in the woods when you go for a hike? Do you think there could be something more out there?
Well, strangers, do we have the podcast for you? I'm Christiana.
And I'm Bree.
Welcome to Something Strange, a podcast covering strange stories ranging from the supernatural, the paranormal, weird history, folklore, and more.
From cryptids to real-life historical figures, from hauntings to peculiar happenings, there's a story here for you. Tune on in the first and third Fridays of each month for our main episodes. But if you can't get enough, check out our mini episodes on the fourth Fridays of each month.
We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube. And for even more strange content, check us out on our socials: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok.
For now, strangers, it's time for us to part ways.
Remember to tune on in.
We'll be right here with Something Strange.
Canadian Creepies is recorded on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. These lands and waters have been cared for since long before Canada existed, and they remain deeply important to Indigenous communities today. As we tell stories about darkness, injustice, and memory, I want to acknowledge the very real histories of colonization, violence, and erasure that Indigenous peoples continue to endure. A land acknowledgement can't undo that harm, but it is a reminder to keep listening, learning, and supporting in truth and reconciliation in meaningful ways. We share these stories not to forget, but to shine light, always with respect for peoples and nations whose land we live on. Canadian Creepies covers true crime, dark history, and disturbing events. Some episodes may include graphic descriptions or sensitive subject matter. We do our best to handle every story with care and respect for those affected. That said, we sometimes use humor and sarcasm as a way to process heavy content, never to disrespect victims, survivors, or their families. Listener discretion is advised. Hey Creeps, I'm Valerie, and welcome to a special solo bonus episode of Canadian Creepies. Today's episode is a little different. We're stepping away from haunted houses and cryptids to talk about something that's unfortunately very real and sometimes surprisingly difficult to spot. Before we begin, I want to give a quick content note. We'll be discussing white supremacist ideology, extremist movements, online radicalization, abusive relationship dynamics, and the manipulation tactics that extremist groups often use to recruit and retain members. This episode isn't meant to make you paranoid, and it's not a guide to be accusing your partner because they've had one bad take on Twitter or made an ignorant comment at Thanksgiving, okay? And it's definitely not about turning every disagreement into a gotcha moment. People can hold uninformed opinions. People can learn. People can grow. That is normal. What we're talking about today is something different. This episode is about patterns of language, patterns of behavior, patterns of secrecy, patterns of manipulation. Because extremist ideologies, whether they're white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi organizations, or other hate movements, don't usually announce themselves on the first date. No one shows up to dinner and says, "Hi, nice to meet you. I collect vintage records, I like hiking, and I belong to a hate group." If only it were that easy. Instead, these beliefs are often introduced gradually. A joke here, a conspiracy theory there, just asking questions, conversation that somehow always circles back to the same handful of talking points. That is how normalization works. So today's episode isn't about diagnosing strangers or encouraging people to play internet detective. It's about recognizing patterns that, when they appear together over time, can signal that someone is being involved with extremist ideology or has been hiding those beliefs all along. Whether you're dating, have teenagers navigating online spaces, or simply want to better understand how radicalization can creep into ordinary relationships, my hope is that this episode gives you a few tools to recognize those patterns before they become something much more dangerous. So, let's talk about red flags. Before we get into the warning signs, we need to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. What most people hear... When most people hear the words white supremacist, they picture someone in a white hood, covered in swastikas, standing at a rally screaming slurs. And these people absolutely exist. But modern white supremacy is often much quieter than that. At its core, white supremacy is the belief that white people, or what someone defines as Western or European civilization, are inherently superior to other racial or ethnic groups, or that they deserve to remain politically, culturally, or socially dominant. That belief doesn't always sound like open hatred. Sometimes it shows up as the idea that society has become anti-white. Sometimes it's the belief that that immigration is part of a deliberate plan to replace white people. Sometimes it's the claim that diversity, multiculturalism, or racial equality are attacks on our culture. And sometimes it's the insistence that giving marginalized communities equal opportunities somehow means white people are being discriminated against. The details can vary, but the underlying worldview is remarkably consistent. It imagines society as a hierarchy where races are competing against each other for power. It frames equality as a loss rather than a shared gain, and it often relies on fear, the fear that white people are being replaced, erased, or stripped of something that they are entitled to keep. Now, it's important to make another distinction here. Someone doesn't have to wake up one morning and announce, "I'm a white supremacist." In fact, most people who hold these beliefs never use that label. Many reject it entirely. Instead, they describe themselves as realists, race realists, Western traditionalists, identitarians, nationalists, or people who are asking questions. And Felix is calling me, so just one moment. If this is your first episode or first time tuning into Canadian Creepies, just so you know, Felix is my son. Okay, back into it. Labels matter far less than beliefs. If someone consistently promotes ideas built on racial hierarchy, dehumanizes entire groups of people, or treats equality as a threat, they're expressing white supremacist beliefs, whether they choose to label it or not. And that's why this episode isn't about tattoos, slogans, or whether someone owns a particular flag. It's about recognizing patterns of behavior that, taken together, reveal a much bigger picture. So, why dating? If extremist groups are trying to spread an ideology, why would they bother with dating apps and relationships? Because people are far more likely to change their beliefs when the message comes from someone they love than from a stranger on the internet. This isn't unique to white supremacist movements, by the way. It's true of cults, abusive relationships, conspiracy movements, gangs, and countless other extremist groups. Trust lowers our defenses. When someone cares about you, you naturally give them the benefit of the doubt. You assume they're acting in good faith. You listen a little longer. You overlook comments you might have challenged if they'd come from someone else. That's exactly why romantic relationships can become such powerful recruitment tools. A partner isn't just someone you spend your time with. They're your confidant, your emotional support, the person you vent to after work, the one whose opinions you hear every single day. They become one of the most influential voices in your life. For someone trying to normalize extremist beliefs, that's an incredibly powerful position to occupy. And here's the thing. Recruitment usually doesn't look like recruitment. It doesn't begin with, here's why you should join a hate group. It begins with jokes, with memes, with interesting podcasts, with complaints that seem reasonable on the surface, with, I'm not racist, but with "I'm just asking questions," with "don't believe everything the mainstream media tells you." Each step on its own can seem small enough to dismiss, but over time, those small moments can shift what feels normal, acceptable, or worth considering. That's why experts who study radicalization often talk about normalization rather than persuasion. The goal usually isn't to convince someone overnight. The goal is to make increasingly extreme ideas feel familiar. And I want to be very clear about something. If you found yourself in a relationship where this happened, that does not make you naive, unintelligent, or weak. Manipulation works because it happens through trust. It happens through affection. It happens through someone you've built a life with. Extremist recruitment doesn't prey on stupidity, it preys on human connection. That's something every single one of us is vulnerable to. And understanding how that process works isn't about assigning blame. It's about giving ourselves and the people we care about the knowledge to recognize it before it goes too far. Let's start with the kinds of red flags that are easy to dismiss. These aren't giant, flashing warning signs. They're little things you brush off because you care about the person. Maybe you tell yourself they're having a bad day. Maybe they're trying to be edgy. Maybe they're just spending too much time online. Sometimes that's exactly what's happening. But sometimes these small moments are the first pieces of a much bigger picture. One thing you might notice is an almost constant obsession with the idea that free speech is under attack. Now, to be clear, people can absolutely have legitimate concerns about free expression. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about someone who seems to bring it up constantly, especially when the conversation revolves around why people should be able to make racist, anti-Semitic, or otherwise hateful comments without criticism. Closely tied to that is an ongoing fixation on being canceled, silenced, or claiming that they can't say anything anymore. Again, context matters. People can genuinely disagree with online pile-ons or public shaming, but if every conversation eventually becomes about how certain groups are supposedly being protected while white people are the real victims, that's worth paying attention to. Another common pattern is using humor as a shield. Maybe they tell jokes that target racial or religious minorities and then immediately say, "Relax, it's just dark humor." Or they make an offensive comment, and when you react, suddenly you're accused of having no sense of humor. Sometimes the phrase isn't, "It's just a joke." Sometimes it's, "I'm just asking questions." That phrase has become incredibly common in extremist spaces because it allows someone to introduce conspiracy theories or racist ideas while avoiding responsibility for them. If challenged, they can always retreat and claim they were just curious. Then there's an unusual fixation on crime statistics, but only certain crime statistics. Instead of looking at poverty, education, housing, or broader social factors, the conversation repeatedly comes back to race, immigration, or special communities. Statistics are presented without context and used to suggest that entire groups of people are inherently dangerous. You may also notice the word culture doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. Rather than openly talking about race, someone starts referring to certain cultures, protecting our culture or cultural incompatibility. Sometimes those conversations are genuine, discussions about integration or public policy. Other times, culture becomes a socially acceptable substitute for talking about race while avoiding the backlash that explicit racism would bring. And finally, pay attention to how they respond when you disagree. Do they welcome conversation? Or do they become immediately defensive? Do they mock your concerns, call you brainwashed, too woke, or say you're too sensitive? Healthy disagreement usually leaves room for discussion. Extremist thinking often doesn't. It tends to treat disagreement as proof that you've been manipulated by the media, universities, or the establishment. Now, I want to emphasize something because it's probably the most important point in this episode. None of these things by themselves make someone a white supremacist. One edgy joke doesn't. One argument about free speech doesn't. One uncomfortable conversation doesn't. We are looking for patterns. Patterns that repeat. Patterns that reinforce one another. Patterns that consistently move in the same direction over weeks, months, or years. It's the accumulation that matters, not a single moment taken out of context. If those early red flags go unchallenged, you may start to notice something else. The language begins to change, not overnight, slowly, almost carefully. You might hear phrases like, "I'm not racist, but," which, let's be honest, has one of the worst track records in the English language. Or maybe it becomes, "I don't hate anyone, they just want to integrate. They're destroying our culture, I'm just stating facts." Notice how the language often sounds less openly hateful than it once did. Modern extremist movements have learned that outright racism turns people away. So instead, they dress old ideas in new clothes. The message stays the same, the packaging just gets better. Another thing you'll notice is what I call selective empathy. Their compassion starts coming with conditions. They're deeply concerned when something happens to people they identify with, but remarkably indifferent or even dismissive when similar things happen to everyone else. A hate crime against one group is tragic. Against another, suddenly there are 1,000 reasons why it's more complicated. The same standards stop applying equally. Pay attention to that. Extremist ideologies often divide the world into two categories, us and them. Once someone starts seeing society through that lens, empathy becomes increasingly selective. You may also notice changes in your own social life. Maybe they suddenly don't like your best friend because she's too woke. Maybe your sibling is brainwashed. Maybe your coworker is one of those people. Little by little, the people who challenge their worldview become people you supposedly shouldn't trust. Now, they probably won't say I'm trying to isolate you. Healthy manipulators rarely do. Instead, they'll frame it as concern. They're a bad influence. They don't respect our relationship. They're filling your head with nonsense. Over time, you find yourself spending less time with people who question the relationship and more time inside your partner's version of reality. And then there's the media. Everyone has their favorite podcasts. Hopefully one of yours is Canadian Creepies. YouTube channels, or news sources. That's completely normal. The question isn't whether they consume political content, it's whether every source they consume tells the same story. That white people are under attack, that immigrants are to blame, that governments are deliberately replacing populations, journalists are lying, universities are indoctrinating children, that every institution is part of one giant conspiracy. Extremist ecosystems thrive on repetition, just with different hosts, different platforms and different personalities. But somehow they all arrive at the exact same conclusion. That's not diversity of thought. That's an echo chamber. And the more time someone spends inside that echo chamber, the more normal those ideas begin to feel. Again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important. None of these signs exist in isolation. Lots of people binge political podcasts. Lots of people get caught in online rabbit holes. Lots of people have opinions you may strongly disagree with. We're not talking about someone who watches one controversial YouTube video. We're talking about a consistent pattern where the language, the media, the friendships, and the worldview all begin moving in the same direction. That's when it's time to stop dismissing your gut feeling and start paying attention. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Support reproductive justice in Niagara. Niagara Reproductive Justice is a grassroots collective based in the Niagara region of Ontario, working to increase visibility and access to sexual and reproductive health care. They support people seeking abortion and other essential care by offering transportation, financial assistance, logistical help, and emotional support. Here's how you can help. You can make a one-time donation. Send an e-transfer to niagarareproductivejustice@gmail.com. Your support helps cover costs like gas for volunteer drivers, overnight stays, childcare, and other urgent needs. You can also support monthly via Patreon. Join their Patreon and support the cause month to month. It's patreon.com/Niagara Reproductive Justice. And you can volunteer your time. NRJ is always looking for volunteers to help with driving, outreach, admin support, and community organizing. If you're looking to make a real impact in the Niagara region, this is a great place to start. Contact them via email or DM them on Instagram or Facebook to learn more. You can find them on Instagram at Niagara Reproductive Justice and on Facebook at Niagara Reproductive Justice. Help amplify access to reproductive care right here in our own backyard. Whether you donate, volunteer, or spread the word, you're a part of the movement. Up until now, we've been talking about warning signs that can be easy to explain away. The next stage is different. At this point, the mask often starts to slip. The jokes become beliefs. The just asking questions turns into certainty. And the person you've been trying to give the benefit of the doubt starts telling you exactly who they are. One of the clearest signs is the emergence of explicit beliefs about racial hierarchy. Maybe they begin talking about some races being naturally more intelligent or more violent, or better suited to lead society. Sometimes they'll call themselves an ethno-nationalist instead of a white supremacist, as though they're changing the label, as though if changing the label changes the belief. It doesn't. If someone believes society should be organized around race or ethnicity, or that certain groups deserve more rights, power, or belonging than others because of who they are, you're no longer dealing with prejudice alone. You're dealing with extremist ideology. Another major warning sign is dehumanizing language. Listen carefully to the words they choose. People stop being people. Instead, they're invaders, they're parasites, they're animals, they're poisoning the country, they're replacing us. History has shown us something over and over again. Before people are denied rights, attacked, or killed, they're first stripped of their humanity. Language is often the first step. Then comes the normalization of violence. Maybe they don't come outright and say violence is good. Instead, they start minimizing hate crimes. It wasn't that bad. They were pushed too far. You have to understand why he snapped. Or they begin portraying the perpetrators of racist attacks as misunderstood victims while focusing more on their grievances than on the people they actually harmed. When someone consistently finds excuses for political violence against marginalized communities, that's not playing the devil's advocate. That is rationalizing extremism. You may also notice they're testing your boundaries. Maybe they start with an off-color joke. You don't respond. So the next time the joke gets a little worse, then it becomes a slur, then a conspiracy theory, then admiration for someone who openly associated with extremist movements. Each time they're watching. Not necessarily consciously, but they're watching. They're learning what you'll challenge and what you'll quietly accept. Silence can become permission, and that's why these comments often escalate when they go unchallenged. And this is where I want to be very clear. At this stage, this is no longer a disagreement over politics. It's no longer about having different opinions. It's no longer about someone being provocative for the sake of it. This is an ideology. One built on exclusion, hierarchy, and the belief that some human beings are worth less than others. You do not owe an extremist unlimited patience in the hope that they'll eventually become the person you wish they were. Your safety, physical, emotional, and psychological matters. And recognizing what you're dealing with is the first step toward protecting it. Let's say you've started noticing these patterns. You bring them up, you ask questions, you say, hey, that comment made me feel uncomfortable. If the response is healthy, you'll probably have a conversation. If the response is manipulative, the conversation starts becoming about you instead of what was said. One of the most common tactics is moving the goalposts. You respond to one claim and suddenly the discussion shifts somewhere else entirely. You answer one question, now there are 3 new ones. You address one conspiracy theory, now they've abandoned it for a different one. The goal isn't understanding, the goal is keeping you off balance. Another classic tactic is telling you you're too emotional. Suddenly your concern isn't valid because you're letting your feelings get in the way. You're overreacting. You're being dramatic. You're too sensitive. Funny how the person ranting for 45 minutes about immigration somehow thinks you're the emotional one. Then comes the rebranding. Bigotry gets dressed up in a suit and tie. Racism becomes realism. Prejudice becomes common sense. Discrimination becomes just looking at facts. It's an attempt to make hateful beliefs sound rational by changing the vocabulary, not the underlying idea. You'll also notice that they often position themselves as the real victim, not the communities being targeted, not the people experiencing discrimination themselves. They'll tell you they can't say anything anymore, that everyone's out to get them, that they're being persecuted for simply telling the truth. This flips the conversation upside down. Instead of talking about the harm caused by their beliefs, you're suddenly comforting them because someone criticized those beliefs. And finally, you hear something like, why can't we just separate politics from who I am? And here's the problem with that. We're not talking about favorite hockey teams. We're not debating pineapple on pizza. We're talking about beliefs that affect how someone sees other human beings. Politics isn't just what happens in Parliament. Politics determines who gets rights, who gets health care, who gets protected, who gets targeted, who feels safe walking down the street. And when someone's worldview is built around the idea that certain people are less deserving because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or identity, that's not a hobby. That's a value system. And value systems shape behavior. They shape the jokes someone tells. The people they trust, the organizations they support, the policies they vote for, the way they treat strangers, the way they might eventually treat you. That's why this isn't simply a political disagreement. It's about whether the person you're building a life with believes all human beings deserve equal dignity. That's a question far bigger than politics. If any of this is starting to sound familiar, I want to talk about something that often gets overlooked. What this kind of relationship can do to you. One of the most unsettling things about extremist ideology is that it rarely arrives all at once. It shows up a little bit at a time, a joke you laugh off, a comment you let slide, a conspiracy theory you don't have enough energy to argue about. And before long, conversations that would have shocked you a year ago start feeling normal. Not because you've changed your values, because human beings adapt to their environment. That's one of the reasons normalization is such a powerful tool. You may also start doubting yourself. Am I overreacting? Maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe they're right. Everyone else is too sensitive. That kind of self-doubt doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because you've been asked over and over again to distrust your own instincts. When someone repeatedly tells you that your concerns are irrational, emotional, or exaggerated, it's easy to start questioning your own judgment. You might also notice your world getting smaller. Maybe you stop bringing certain friends around because you know it'll end in an argument. Maybe you avoid family dinners. Maybe there are topics you've learned not to mention because it's just easier to keep the peace. Over time, you can find yourself editing what you say, who you spend time with, and even what you post online, not because those choices feel authentic, but because you're trying to avoid another exhausting confrontation. That is a very heavy way to live. And here's the part I hope you hear most clearly. You are not responsible for fixing someone else's ideology. Love doesn't de-radicalize people. Patience doesn't magically erase deeply held beliefs. And sacrificing your own values in the hope that someone will eventually become who they used to be isn't a safe strategy. It's a burden you were never meant to carry. People can absolutely change, but they have to choose that work for themselves. Your responsibility is not to rescue someone from an ideology they are committed to. Your responsibility is to protect your own safety, your own well-being, and your own sense of reality. If this episode has done anything, I hope it's reminded you that trusting your instincts isn't being paranoid. Sometimes it's simply recognizing a pattern before it becomes impossible to ignore. So, when is it time to leave? Only you can answer that question. But if you recognize a consistent pattern throughout this episode, if the comments are becoming more extreme, the manipulation is increasing, your world is getting smaller, and you're finding yourself afraid to speak honestly, it's worth asking whether this relationship is still safe for you. Notice I said safe and not perfect. One of the hardest things about leaving someone with extremist beliefs is that we often wait for one final piece of proof, a confession, a membership card, a swastika tattoo, some dramatic moment that finally gives us permission to leave. And the reality is you do not need a smoking gun. You do not need someone to announce, I'm a white supremacist. And you do not need to wait until you're absolutely certain beyond all doubt. If a pattern of behavior consistently leaves you feeling unsafe, controlled, isolated, or fearful, that's enough to take seriously. Your feelings aren't evidence in a courtroom, they're information. If you decide to leave, think about your safety in more than one way. There's your emotional safety. Who can you call? Who believes you? Who can remind you who you are when you've spent months or years questioning your own judgment? There's your physical safety. If you're worried that ending a relationship could escalate into intimidation, stalking, or violence, don't feel like you have to do it alone. Make a plan. Tell someone you trust. Meet in a public place if that's appropriate, or consider ending contact from a safe location. And don't forget about your digital safety. Change your passwords, enable two-factor authentication, review location sharing on your phone. Think about who has access to your accounts, your devices, or your social media. Sometimes leaving a relationship means protecting more than your heart. It means protecting your privacy too. If there have been threatening message, harassment, or behavior that makes you feel unsafe, consider documenting it. Save screenshots, write down dates and incidents while they're fresh in your mind. Hopefully, you'll never need them. But if you do, you'll be glad you kept a record. Most importantly, don't go through this alone. Reach out to friends, family, a counselor, a support worker, someone who knows you outside of the relationship and can help you in the situation clearly. Leaving someone, especially someone you've loved, is rarely easy. But staying in a relationship where your safety, your values, or your sense of reality are slowly being eroded isn't an act of loyalty. It's a cost that's too high. You deserve relationships built on respect, on honesty, on compassion, not on fear, manipulation, or the hope that one day someone will stop believing you deserve less than everyone else. Protecting your well-being isn't selfish. Sometimes it's the bravest decision you'll ever make. As we wrap up, I want to come back to something that I said at the beginning. This episode was never about teaching you to be suspicious about everyone you date. It wasn't about creating paranoia, and it certainly wasn't about encouraging people to label someone a white supremacist because of one bad opinion, one awkward conversation, or one regrettable comment. This episode has always been about patterns, because extremist ideologies don't survive on giant public speeches anymore. They survive in smaller moments, in silence, in minimizing harmful comments, in laughing off just a joke, in convincing good people that they're overreaching, in asking us to ignore one more red flag, and then another and another. Normalization doesn't happen all at once. It happens one compromise at a time, one excuse at a time, one conversation that never gets challenged, one relationship where someone learns they can keep pushing the boundary because no one pushes back. Refusing to normalize harm isn't the same as demonizing people. It means recognizing that ideas have consequences. The way we talk about other human beings shapes the way we treat them. The things we excuse today become the things we tolerate tomorrow. And the things we tolerate tomorrow eventually become the world we all have to live in. So if there is one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it is this. Pay attention to patterns. Trust your instincts. Protect your peace. And never convince yourself that love requires you to ignore beliefs that deny someone else's humanity. Because if someone's worldview depends on other people being seen as less human, love alone will never make that relationship safe. Thanks for listening, creeps. Be kind to one another, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.